I sometimes try to remember what normal felt like. What it was like to wake up in my own bed, to have breakfast with my family, to ride my bike down our street without looking over my shoulder. But those memories fade a little more each year. For 3,427 days, yes, I counted every single one, I lived in a basement. A prisoner. A ghost. Sometimes I think it would be easier to just forget everything that happened to me, but then, who would I be? My name is Lisa Miller, and this is the story of how I was stolen from my life at 11 years old, and how I fought to get it back. I'm 32 now. Most people look at me and see a normal woman. They have no idea what I've survived. They don't see the scars, some visible, most not. They don't know that I still sleep with the lights on, that I check the locks on my doors and windows 3 times before bed, that I've memorized every possible exit in any room I enter. Old habits die hard, I guess. Before I tell you everything, I need you to understand something: monsters exist. They don't have fangs or claws. They look like regular people. They smile at you in grocery stores. They wave to their neighbors. They blend in. My monster's name was Richard Keller. It was June 8, 2003. School had just let out for summer break, and I was that special kind of happy that only exists when you're a kid with endless summer days stretching ahead of you. Mom had let me walk to the corner store by myself, a new privilege I'd earned after begging for months. I felt so grown up in my purple shorts and my favorite t-shirt with a rainbow on it. I can still remember the weight of the $5 bill in my pocket, how important I felt being trusted to make my own purchases. The store was only 4 blocks from our house, straight down Maple Street and right on Oak. I'd made it there with no problem, bought myself an ice cream sandwich and some bubble gum. The cashier, an older man with kind eyes, had even given me exact change and said, "Careful crossing the street, young lady." I never made it home. I remember pausing at the corner, waiting for the light to change, licking my ice cream as it melted down my fingers in the summer heat. A blue van pulled up beside me. The window rolled down. "Excuse me," a man said. His voice was friendly, concerned. "I think I'm lost. Do you know where Pine Road is?" I was raised to be polite, but also cautious around strangers. Mom and Dad had drilled it into me: don't get in cars with people you don't know. But this was different, I thought. I wasn't getting in his car. I was just giving directions. "I think it's that way," I pointed, taking a small step back from the curb. His face changed then, from friendly to focused. "Actually, I have a map right here. Could you just take a quick look?" I'm really turned around. I hesitated. Something felt wrong. But I was 11, and adults were authorities you didn't question. I took one step forward. That's all it took. One step. His arm shot out through the window, grabbing my wrist with a grip so tight I dropped my ice cream. Before I could scream, he yanked me forward and his other hand clamped something over my mouth and nose, a rag that smelled sweet and chemical. I kicked and thrashed, but my limbs felt suddenly heavy, like moving through molasses. The world tilted sideways, voices and street sounds becoming distant, underwater. I woke up in darkness so complete I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. The floor beneath me was cold concrete. The air smelled musty and damp, like wet dirt and mildew. I was no longer wearing my rainbow shirt or purple shorts, but an oversized t-shirt that wasn't mine. My head pounded. My mouth felt like it was stuffed with cotton. I screamed. I screamed until my throat was raw, until no sound would come out anymore. No one answered. No one came. Hours later, though it could have been minutes or days, I had no way to tell, a door at the top of stairs I couldn't see opened. Light flooded in, blinding me. A silhouette stood in the doorway. "You can scream all you want," his voice, said calmly. "No one will hear you. This is your home now." The door closed, and darkness swallowed me again. I curled into a ball, shivering. I was certain this was a nightmare, that any moment I'd wake up in my bed with its pink comforter and stuffed animals. But the cold floor against my skin was too real. The thirst burning my throat was too real. The fear choking me was too real. That was my first day in captivity. I didn't know then that there would be 3,426 more. I didn't know what he had planned for me, why he had taken me. I didn't know if my parents were looking for me, if anyone was looking for me. All I knew was that the world I had belonged to was gone, replaced by darkness and the footsteps of a monster on the stairs. In those first days, I thought about my family constantly. Mom, who braided my hair every morning before school. Dad, who called me Firefly because I couldn't sit still at bedtime. My little brother Tommy, who followed me everywhere. Did they miss me? Were they scared? Were they still having dinner at the kitchen table, with my empty chair like an open wound? I promised myself I would see them again. I promised myself I would survive. But as days turned to weeks, and weeks to months, that promise became harder to keep. Richard had rules. Endless rules. Rules about when I could speak. Rules about what I could eat. Rules about where I could sleep. Breaking the rules meant punishment, sometimes no food, sometimes darkness for days, sometimes worse things I still can't talk about. The basement became my universe. A small bathroom in the corner. A mattress on the floor. A single light bulb that he controlled from upstairs. No windows. No way to tell day from night. No way to know if it was summer or winter outside. Time stretched and warped. I scratched marks into the wall with a forgotten nail I'd found, one line for each day. When I filled one wall, I started on another. Counting became my anchor to sanity. It was the only way I could prove to myself that I was still real, that my life before hadn't been just a dream. I learned to read his moods, to anticipate what might trigger his anger. I became smaller, quieter, trying to disappear even while trapped in that basement. I built walls inside myself, places he couldn't reach, couldn't contaminate. And I watched. I listened. I waited. Because even in those early days, when hope felt like a distant memory, something inside me refused to break entirely. Something inside me whispered, "Someday, you will get out of here. Someday, you will make him pay." Little did I know then how long that someday would take, or what I would have to do to survive until it came. The first year was the hardest. Each morning, if you could call it morning when there was no sun, I'd wake up hoping it had all been a nightmare. For a few blissful seconds, my mind would still be half asleep, and I'd think I was home. Then reality would crash down on me as I felt the thin mattress beneath me and smelled the damp basement air. In those early months, I was sure someone would find me. My parents wouldn't just give up looking. The police would search everywhere. Someone would notice something suspicious about Richard and investigate. When he'd leave the house, I'd scream until my voice gave out, hoping a neighbor might hear. But no one ever came. I learned quickly that Richard had planned everything meticulously. The basement was soundproofed, something he took pride in telling me. "Spent months getting it ready for you," he'd say, like I should be grateful. The small basement windows had been sealed with concrete and painted over to match the walls. The only entrance was the door at the top of the stairs, which had 3 different locks on it. And as he reminded me often, his property was isolated, with the nearest neighbor too far away to hear anything. Richard worked some kind of night job. I never knew exactly what he did, but he'd leave in the evening and return in the morning. His schedule became my only way to track time. When the door opened and footsteps came down the stairs in the morning, that was my day beginning. When he left in the evening, that was my night. At first, he kept me chained to a metal hook in the wall. I had just enough chain to reach the bathroom in the corner, a toilet and sink with no mirror, but not enough to reach the stairs. The chain rubbed my ankle raw, leaving scars I still have today. After several months, once he was confident I was trained enough, he removed the chain. But by then, I'd learned that physical restraints weren't his only method of control. Isolation does things to your mind. When the only human face you see belongs to your captor, your sense of reality starts to warp. Richard knew this. He used it deliberately, methodically breaking down who I was to rebuild me how he wanted. Your parents stopped looking for you after 3 months, he told me one day, about 6 months in. There was a small article in the newspaper. Search scaled back for missing girl. I saved it for you. He never actually showed me this article. I don't know if it existed or if it was just another lie to crush my hope. They've probably had another kid by now, he said another time. A replacement. That's what people do. I tried not to believe him, but when you hear something enough times, with no other voices to contradict it, doubt creeps in. Maybe they had forgotten me. Maybe the world outside had moved on. Food became another form of control. Richard would bring me meals, if you could call them that, at irregular intervals. Sometimes twice a day, sometimes once every 2 days. I never knew when I would eat next, so when food appeared, I learned to eat it all immediately, even if I wasn't hungry. He seemed to enjoy watching me shovel cold beans or dry cereal into my mouth like an animal. Good girl, he'd say, in the same tone someone might use with a dog. See how well I take care of you? By the end of that first year, I had lost so much weight that my ribs stuck out sharply beneath my skin. My once thick brown hair fell out in clumps from malnutrition. I barely recognized myself when I caught glimpses of my reflection in the bathroom sink water. But humans adapt. Even to hell. Gradually, I developed routines to keep myself sane. I exercised in the small space I had, jumping jacks, push-ups, running in place. I made up stories in my head, elaborate fantasies about rescue and revenge. I sang every song I could remember from before, whispering the lyrics when I was alone. I started talking to myself, having full conversations to remember what my voice sounded like. Sometimes I'd pretend to talk to my mom or dad, telling them about my day as if we were sitting at dinner. Other times I'd talk to my little brother Tommy, making up adventures we were having together. I knew it wasn't healthy, but it kept me connected to who I had been. There were books sometimes. Richard would bring down dog-eared paperbacks he'd found at thrift stores. Nothing new or popular that might remind me of the outside world. Just old romance novels, outdated textbooks, or religious texts. I read them all, over and over, until I had passages memorized. Words became my escape when physical escape was impossible. The basement itself became familiar territory. 12 steps from the bathroom to the mattress. 8 steps from the mattress to the far wall. 20 steps to walk the perimeter. I knew every crack in the concrete, every water stain on the ceiling, every spider that made its home in the corners. In some twisted way, it became a sort of home, the only constant in my new reality. Richard had rules that changed constantly, which I think was intentional, to keep me off balance, always afraid of breaking one. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't look him in the eye. Don't ask questions. Don't cry. Don't make noise when he's trying to sleep. The punishments for breaking rules ranged from withholding food to locking me in the small utility closet in the basement for days. The utility closet was my greatest fear. Barely big enough for me to sit with my knees pulled up to my chest, completely dark, and usually locked for 24 to 48 hours at a time. In that tiny space, with no room to move, no light, no sound except my own breathing, I came closest to breaking completely. After one particularly long stint in the closet, punishment for asking if I could have a hairbrush, I emerged different. Something inside me had shifted. I realized that if I wanted to survive, really survive with my mind intact, I needed to be smarter than him. I needed to play along on the outside while keeping my true self hidden deep inside. So I began to study Richard like he was a textbook. I noticed that he was more likely to be violent when he smelled like alcohol. I learned that complimenting the food he brought, no matter how disgusting, would often result in larger portions. I discovered that asking for things directly never worked, but casually mentioning something I read about blankets in this book might result in one appearing days later. I became an actress, playing the role of the submissive, grateful captive. "Thank you for taking care of me," I'd say, swallowing my revulsion. "I don't know what I'd do without you." The words tasted like poison, but they were necessary. Each small bit of approval from him earned me tiny freedoms: an extra book, a pencil and paper, a second blanket when winter made the basement freezing. The hardest part was holding on to myself through it all. At night, when he was gone, I'd whisper my real name over and over. Lisa Miller. Lisa Miller. Not girl or you as he called me. I'd recite facts about my life before. My mother's birthday was April 12th. My favorite ice cream was mint chocolate chip. I had won a spelling bee in 4th grade. I was allergic to cats. These became my anchors to reality. As long as I remembered who I was before, he couldn't completely erase me. By the end of that first year, I had learned the most important lesson of my captivity. To survive, I needed to make him believe he had won, while secretly gathering my strength for the day I might find a way out. I didn't know then that it would take 8 more years before that day would come, or what versions of myself I would have to become along the way. By my 3rd year in that basement, I had developed what I can only describe as 2 separate versions of myself. There was Basement Lisa, compliant, quiet, careful not to trigger Richard's rage. She smiled when appropriate, spoke only when spoken to, and had learned exactly how to minimize pain and maximize survival. Then there was real Lisa, the girl I had been, the woman I was becoming, who lived deep inside, hidden away where Richard couldn't reach her. I turned 14 in that basement, though I only knew this because I had kept obsessive track of days by scratching marks into the concrete behind my mattress. No one sang happy birthday. There was no cake, no presents, no acknowledgement that I was growing up in darkness. Instead, that day was like any other. Richard brought down a bowl of canned soup in the morning, left for work, and returned hours later to sit on the stairs and talk at me about his day. His talks had become a regular ritual. He would describe mundane details of his life outside, complaints about coworkers, traffic, the weather, as if we were a normal couple sharing our days. I was expected to listen attentively, to nod and make appropriate sounds of interest or sympathy. It was surreal and twisted, this pantomime of normal human connection. "You're the only one who understands me," he would sometimes say, reaching out to touch my hair. "Everyone else out there is fake. But you're real. You see the real me." I didn't. What I saw was a deeply disturbed man who had stolen my life. But Basement Lisa would nod and say, "I know, because that's what kept me alive." The physical changes in my body became another source of tension. I was becoming a teenager, developing in ways that couldn't be hidden. Richard noticed, of course. His eyes lingered longer. His accidental touches increased. The oversized t-shirts he provided grew tighter. I tried to hunch my shoulders, to make myself smaller, to delay the inevitable. One night, after he'd been drinking heavily, he came down the stairs unsteady on his feet. His eyes had that glazed, unfocused look that always made my stomach knot with dread. "Stand up," he ordered. I did as I was told, keeping my eyes on the floor. "You're not a little girl anymore," he slurred, circling me slowly. Not the same little brat I picked up. You're growing up. His hand reached out, touching my cheek, then sliding down my neck, my shoulder. I froze, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. In that moment, something inside me, the real Lisa, screamed in warning. This was a line that, once crossed, would destroy whatever small part of myself I had managed to preserve. For the first time in years, I backed away from him. "Don't," I whispered. His face darkened. "What did you say to me?" "Please don't," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "I don't want this." The back of his hand connected with my face so fast I didn't see it coming. The force knocked me backward onto the mattress. Before I could recover, he was on top of me, pinning my wrists above my head with one hand. "You don't get to want or not want," he hissed, his face inches from mine, breath reeking of whiskey. "You are mine. I own you. I decide everything about your life." What happened next is something I've tried for years to block out. Therapists tell me that protective amnesia is common in trauma survivors. Parts of that night remain mercifully blurry, but others are etched into my memory with horrible clarity. The weight of him, the smell, the pain, the way I retreated so far inside myself it was like floating above my body, watching from the ceiling. Afterward, he left me curled in a ball on the mattress. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I felt nothing at all, a complete numbness that was somehow worse than pain. For the first time, I truly understood that he could and would take everything from me, until there was nothing left. That night marked the beginning of the darkest period of my captivity. The assaults became regular. The psychological games intensified. The lines between Basement Lisa and real Lisa began to blur dangerously. There were days when I would forget my mother's face, my father's voice, the feeling of sunshine on my skin. I began to have intrusive thoughts about ending it all. There weren't many options in that basement, but I considered them all with a detached, clinical interest. The sheet from the mattress could be twisted into a rope. I could refuse to eat until I starved. I could try to attack Richard and force him to kill me in rage. The only thing that stopped me was stubbornness, a burning, irrational refusal to let him win completely. If I died in that basement, he would get away with everything. No one would ever know what he had done. My family would never have answers. The thought was unbearable. So I retreated further inside myself, building stronger walls around what remained of real Lisa. I created a third version of myself, a cold, calculating observer who watched everything with detachment, looking for weaknesses, opportunities, anything that might someday lead to freedom or justice. This new part of me noticed things. Like how Richard would sometimes forget to lock the basement door when he was drunk. How the ring of keys would occasionally be left on the bottom step when his hands were full bringing down supplies. How he had started to grow careless, believing I was completely broken. I started to test boundaries in small ways. I would move things slightly, a book, a plate, to see if he noticed. He usually didn't. I would ask innocuous questions about the outside world to gauge his reactions. I began exercising more intensely when he wasn't there, preparing my body for something. I didn't know what yet, but I needed to be ready. Then came the day that changed everything again. Richard came down the stairs looking agitated, distracted. Usually, he would notice immediately if anything in the basement was different, but that day his eyes skimmed over me like I wasn't even there. "What's wrong?" I asked carefully, knowing that his stress often became my pain. He paced the small space, running his hands through his thinning hair. "Fucking cops," he muttered. My heart leapt, but I kept my face neutral. Cops? Some kid went missing 2 counties over. They're going door to door asking questions, looking in people's homes. He kicked the wall hard. Like I had anything to do with that. This was the first concrete information I'd had in years that the outside world still existed, that there were still police, still investigations. That people looked for missing children. It was like a window opening in a sealed room, letting in a breath of fresh air. "They won't come here," I said, trying to sound soothing while my mind raced. "They're looking for a different kid." "They better not," he snarled. "I've got too much invested in this setup." "In you." He reached out to grab my chin roughly. "If they ever did, you know what to say, right?" I nodded. We had rehearsed this many times. If anyone ever asked, I was his niece. My parents had died in a car accident. I was homeschooled because of anxiety. I loved my uncle. I was happy here. All lies that tasted like ash in my mouth. After he left that night, I lay on my mattress staring at the ceiling, the most dangerous thing of all blooming in my chest: hope. There were still people looking for missing children. The police were still doing their jobs. And most importantly, Richard was scared. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to think about escape as a real possibility, not just a fantasy. I began to plan, meticulously, patiently. If police were in the area, maybe they would eventually come here. I needed to be ready. I needed to find a way to signal them, to let them know I was here without Richard realizing what I was doing. I didn't know then that it would take another 5 years before my opportunity would come. But that night, as I counted the 1095th mark on my wall, 3 full years in captivity, something fundamental shifted inside me. I was no longer just surviving. I was preparing to fight back. Years 4, 5, and 6 blended together in a haze of routine terror and calculated survival. I was 17 now, though I hardly resembled the teenager I should have been. No driver's license. No high school dances. No college applications. Instead, I had become an expert in the science of my captor, predicting his moods, managing his anger, and slowly, methodically exploiting his weaknesses. Richard's drinking had gotten worse. What started as weekend binges had evolved into near-daily intoxication. He would stumble down the stairs, slurring his words, sometimes passing out before he could make it back up. These blackouts became my classroom, opportunities to study the basement door, to search his pockets for keys, to understand the layout of the house from the snippets I could see when the door was open. One night, after he had collapsed on the stairs in a drunken stupor, I dared to climb past him. My heart pounded so violently I was certain it would wake him, but he didn't stir. At the top of the stairs was a kitchen, dimly visible in the moonlight filtering through curtained windows. I could see a refrigerator, a table with chairs, ordinary things that now seemed alien to me. I didn't leave. As desperate as I was for freedom, I knew I wasn't ready. I had no idea where we were located, if there were neighbors nearby, or if I could even find help before he caught me. After years of malnutrition and limited movement, I wasn't sure I had the physical strength to get far enough away. Most importantly, I knew what Richard was capable of, and the thought of being caught attempting escape terrified me more than staying. So I memorized everything I could about the kitchen, the location of the doors, the knife block on the counter, the landline phone on the wall, and silently retreated back to the basement. That night was the first time I felt a shift in power, subtle but significant. I could have left but chose not to, on my terms, according to my plan. The decision, for once, had been mine. Over the following months, I began gathering information and resources. When Richard would bring down old newspapers for me to read, always weeks out of date, with certain sections conspicuously missing, I'd scan them for clues about our location. Weather reports sometimes mentioned nearby towns. Local news sometimes included landmarks I might recognize if I ever got outside. I started stealing small items, a safety pin from his laundry, a ballpoint pen that rolled out of his pocket, even a small paring knife he had absent-mindedly brought down with a plate of food. I hid these treasures in a small hole I'd dug beneath a loose section of baseboard. My arsenal was pathetic, but it was mine. The assault that had begun in year 3 continued, but I had developed a terrifying ability to disconnect from my body during these episodes. I would retreat deep into my mind, focusing on elaborate fantasies of rescue or revenge. Sometimes I would recite books I had memorized word for word in my head, drowning out the reality of what was happening to my body. It was a necessary survival mechanism, though I would later learn in therapy how damaging this dissociation would be to my recovery. During year 6, Richard lost his job. I never knew exactly what he did, but the change in routine was immediate and alarming. Suddenly he was home all the time, his comings and goings no longer predictable. My small windows of solitude disappeared. The drinking increased. The rages became more frequent and less predictable. "It's not fair," he would slur, pacing the basement like a caged animal. 20 years at that place, and they throw me away like garbage. Do they know who I am? What I'm capable of? I would nod sympathetically, playing the role of the supportive listener while inwardly cataloging each new piece of information. 20 years at his workplace meant he was probably in his 40s or 50s. His growing financial stress might make him desperate, careless. These were things I could potentially use. The job loss changed our dynamic in unexpected ways. Richard began to talk about our future, delusional ramblings about moving somewhere new, starting over, how I would finally see the sun again. At first, I thought these were just drunken fantasies, but he started bringing down real estate listings, photographs of houses in rural areas. "What do you think of this one?" he asked one day, showing me a picture of a cabin surrounded by dense forest. "Miles from anyone. We could be free there. You could even go outside sometimes, when I'm sure you won't run." The idea terrified me. If he moved us to an even more isolated location, my chances of ever being found would disappear completely. But I forced a smile. "It looks peaceful." "We'd need money first," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "A lot of money." His financial situation deteriorated rapidly. Bill collectors called constantly. I could hear the phone ringing upstairs, followed by his shouting. Sometimes the electricity would cut out for days. The food he brought down became even more meager, canned goods past their expiration dates, nearly spoiled meat, whatever was cheapest. Then one evening, he came down the stairs with something I hadn't seen in years, a hairbrush, shampoo, clean clothes that looked new rather than thrift store cast-offs. He set them on the edge of my mattress without meeting my eyes. "Clean yourself up," he said gruffly. "Make yourself look nice." A cold dread settled in my stomach. "Why?" "Don't ask questions," he snapped. "Just do it." After he left, I examined the clothes, jeans, a simple blouse, even new underwear with tags still attached. The sizes were wrong, too small, a chilling reminder of how he still saw me as the little girl he'd abducted. I'd been surviving on minimal food for years. My body was thin from malnutrition, but I had still grown taller, developed into a young woman despite the circumstances. When Richard returned hours later, he looked me over critically. "It'll do," he said finally. "Listen carefully. Tomorrow I'm bringing someone here. A business associate. He's going to pay a lot of money to spend time with you." The floor seemed to drop out from under me. In all my worst nightmares about my captivity, this possibility had never occurred to me. One monster had been survivable. I had learned his patterns, his weaknesses. But a stranger? Someone who had paid for access to me? The thought was unbearable. "No," I said, my voice barely audible. "What did you say?" Richard stepped closer, his face darkening. A reckless courage possessed me. I said no. "I won't do it. You can beat me, starve me, whatever. I won't do that. The blow came as expected, knocking me to the ground. But instead of cowering, I looked up at him, blood trickling from my split lip. If you bring someone else down here, I'll tell them everything. I'll tell them I was kidnapped, that you've kept me prisoner for years. I'll scream and fight until they can't possibly ignore what's happening. Richard stared at me, momentarily shocked by my defiance. Then he laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. You think anyone who'd pay for this would care? You think they'd help you? Maybe not, I said, rising slowly to my feet. But they might start wondering what else you're hiding. They might get nervous, sloppy. They might talk to the wrong person someday. Can you really trust anyone else with your secret? I could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. Richard was many terrible things, but he wasn't stupid. He'd managed to keep me hidden for 6 years by trusting no one. Bringing others into this basement violated his own careful system. And what if you fight? What if you make it unpleasant? He said finally. You wouldn't be worth the money. Exactly, I replied, hardly believing I was negotiating with him like this. You'll lose your investment. We stood there in silence, locked in a strange battle of wills. Finally, he turned and stormed up the stairs, slamming the door behind him. I collapsed onto the mattress, shaking uncontrollably, certain I had just signed my death warrant with my defiance. But no stranger came the next day. Or the day after. Richard returned to his sullen, drunken routine, but the terrifying plan seemed to have been abandoned. It was my first real victory, the first time my words had changed the course of my captivity. The incident taught me something crucial. Richard needed me to be compliant. My value to him, whatever twisted value that was, depended on my cooperation. It was a small shift in the power dynamic, but significant. I began to see that while he controlled the physical circumstances of my imprisonment, I wasn't completely powerless. I started testing these boundaries carefully. Small refusals, moments of controlled defiance, always calibrated to avoid the worst of his rage but to gradually establish that I wasn't a completely passive object to be used however he wished. Sometimes this resulted in punishment, no food for days, confinement in the utility closet, but I endured it, knowing I was fighting for something more important than momentary comfort. In my 7th year of captivity, as I marked my 18th birthday with another scratch on the wall, I realized something that both terrified and empowered me. Richard was afraid of me. Not physically, he was still stronger, still had all the literal keys to my prison, but in some deeper way. He was afraid of my resilience, my intelligence, my growing understanding of his vulnerabilities. He needed me to be broken, and despite everything, I wasn't. Not completely. And in that unbroken part of me, a plan was forming, one that would either lead to my freedom or to my death. Either way, I had decided, my time in that basement was coming to an end. 9 years. Almost half my life spent in a basement. 3,285 days marked on walls that had become a calendar of my lost youth. I was 20 now, a young woman who had never been on a date, never driven a car, never voted, never had a legal drink. I had spent my teenage years in darkness, my only education coming from outdated books and newspapers, my only human interaction with a monster. Richard's drinking had escalated to dangerous levels. He would disappear for days, leaving me without food or water, then return in a state of incoherent rage or weeping self-pity. The house above me was falling into disrepair. I could hear the evidence in leaking pipes, creaking floorboards, and the occasional crash of something breaking. His financial situation had become desperate. The electricity would cut out for weeks at a time. In winter, the basement became so cold I could see my breath, huddled under thin blankets. In summer, it was suffocatingly hot, the air thick with humidity and mold. I developed a persistent cough that never quite went away, my lungs struggling with the damp, stale air. But even as the physical conditions worsened, I felt mentally stronger than I had in years. The resources in my hidden cache had grown: a rusted nail file, several paper clips I had straightened and bent into crude lockpicks, a lighter Richard had dropped, even a small screwdriver I'd managed to steal during one of his blackouts. I practiced with these tools obsessively when I was alone, teaching myself to pick the lock on the utility closet door, though I'd never been able to try the skills on the main basement door. I had also developed a better understanding of the house layout. During Richard's longer absences, I'd risk climbing the stairs to press my ear against the door, listening to the sounds of the house, trying to visualize the rooms beyond. Once, during a power outage when he was passed out drunk, I'd even managed to peek through the keyhole, catching glimpses of the kitchen in the beam of his forgotten flashlight. The plan that had been forming in my mind for years was now almost fully developed. I knew I would have exactly one chance. If I failed, Richard would either kill me or move me somewhere I'd never be found. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The opportunity came on what I later learned was October 12, 2012. Richard had been on a 3-day drinking binge, his behavior more erratic than usual. He came down to the basement in the early evening, swaying on his feet, eyes unfocused. "Need to show you something," he slurred, gesturing for me to follow him up the stairs. This was unprecedented. In 9 years, he had never invited me upstairs. My heart raced with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Was this the moment I'd been waiting for? I followed him cautiously, every sense on high alert. At the top of the stairs, the kitchen was even more dilapidated than I'd imagined: dirty dishes piled in the sink, garbage overflowing, bottles covering every surface. The window above the sink showed darkness outside, with the distant pinpricks of stars visible. I hadn't seen stars in 9 years. The sight nearly brought me to my knees. Richard stumbled into what appeared to be a living room, gesturing grandly at a small television set. "Look," he commanded, turning it on. The screen flickered to life, showing a news broadcast. "Watch," he said, dropping heavily onto a stained couch. The broadcast showed a man in a suit speaking solemnly to the camera. Behind him was a photograph I recognized with a shock that felt like electricity. It was me. A school picture from 5th grade, my hair in braids, gap-toothed smile beaming at the camera. Below it was another image, a computer-generated one showing what I might look like now. 10 years since the disappearance of Lisa Miller, the newscaster was saying. Today her family held a memorial service, officially acknowledging what they have long feared, that their daughter is no longer alive. I stared at the screen in stunned silence. My family. They were there, older but recognizable, my mother's face lined with grief, my father's hair now gray, my brother Tommy now a young man taller than both of them. They were laying flowers at what appeared to be a small memorial stone. "They gave up on you," Richard said, a cruel smile twisting his face. "They think you're dead. No one is looking anymore." The newscaster continued. "While police have never officially closed the case, investigators admit that with no new leads in nearly a decade, the chances of finding Lisa alive are virtually non-existent." Something inside me, something that had been bending for 9 years without breaking, finally snapped. Not with despair, but with a cold, clear rage. My family hadn't forgotten me. They had mourned me, remembered me, loved me all this time. And this man, this pathetic, drunken monster, had stolen not just my freedom but their peace. "See?" Richard was saying, seemingly pleased with himself for showing me this. "You're mine now. Forever. No one else wants you." I looked at him sitting there, so confident in his power over me, and made my decision. It wasn't a frantic, desperate choice. It was calm, calculated, and absolute. "You're right," I said quietly. "No one is coming for me." I moved closer to him, adopting the submissive posture I knew made him feel powerful. "I've been thinking, maybe we should leave here." Start fresh somewhere, like you talked about before. His bloodshot eyes narrowed suspiciously, but I could see the idea appealed to him. Yeah. You'd like that? His words ran together, his intoxication obvious. I would, I lied. But we'd need money, right? For a new place? He nodded sullenly. Banks won't lend to me anymore. Credit's shot. What about your truck? I asked, remembering the vehicle I'd glimpsed through the kitchen window on rare occasions. Could we sell it, buy something cheaper? Can't, he mumbled. It's how we'd get to the new place. I moved closer still, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run, to get away from him. Maybe I could help you think of something. I'm good at solving problems. His hand reached out, grabbing my wrist with bruising force. You trying to trick me, girl? You think I'm stupid? No, I said, forcing myself to meet his eyes. I think you're smart. Smart enough to know we can't stay here much longer. The house is falling apart. Bills aren't getting paid. I gestured to the TV, still showing the news. And now no one's looking for me. It's the perfect time to start over. He stared at me for what felt like an eternity, his alcohol-soaked brain processing my words. Finally, he released my wrist and leaned back on the couch. Maybe you're right, he said, his eyelids drooping. Need to sleep first. Think better in the morning. Within minutes, he was unconscious, snoring loudly. I stood very still, hardly daring to breathe. This was it, my one chance. The front door was just across the room. Through it lay a world I hadn't seen in 9 years, a world where my family still remembered me, where I might still reclaim some piece of my stolen life. But I didn't move toward the door. Not yet. First, I went to the kitchen and found what I needed, a roll of duct tape left on the counter, a kitchen knife from the drawer. Methodically, with hands steadier than I would have thought possible, I secured Richard to the couch, wrapping tape around his ankles, his wrists, his mouth. He stirred once during the process, but was too intoxicated to fully wake. When I was sure he couldn't follow me, I went to the desk in the corner of the living room and found what I was looking for, a wallet with identification, an address book, bills with the house address on them. Evidence. Proof of who he was, where we were, what he had done. Only then did I approach the front door. My hand shook as I reached for the knob, my breath coming in short gasps. What lay beyond this door was as terrifying as it was necessary, a world I no longer knew how to navigate, people I no longer knew how to talk to, a freedom I no longer remembered how to use. I looked back once at Richard, still unconscious on the couch. The monster of my nightmares, reduced to a pathetic, restrained figure. I felt no satisfaction, no triumph, only a hollow exhaustion and a single burning certainty. I would never set foot in this house again. I opened the door. The cool night air hit my face like a physical shock, carrying scents I had almost forgotten, grass, trees, the world itself. I stepped outside for the first time in 9 years, papers clutched in one hand, knife in the other, my heart pounding with terror and determination. I had no idea where I was, how far I would need to go to find help, or if my weakened body would carry me there. But as I took that first step away from my prison, I made myself a promise: I would live. Not just survive, but live. If I had endured 9 years in that basement, I could endure whatever it took to reclaim my life. I began to walk, following the dirt driveway away from the house. Above me, the stars seemed to pulse with a message: you are not forgotten. You are not lost. You are Lisa Miller, and you are finally going home. Freedom, I discovered, was as terrifying as it was beautiful. That first night, stumbling down a rural road in the darkness, I felt exposed and vulnerable in ways I hadn't anticipated. Every sound made me jump. Every passing car sent me diving into ditches, certain that Richard had somehow escaped and was hunting me down. The open sky above me felt too vast after years of concrete walls and low ceilings. The wind against my skin was an alien sensation. I walked for hours, guided only by the distant glow of what I hoped was a town. My body, weak from years of malnutrition and limited movement, protested with every step. My lungs burned. My muscles screamed. But I kept moving, clutching the papers I'd taken, my evidence, my proof, my ticket back to the world. Just before dawn, I reached what appeared to be a gas station, its fluorescent lights humming in the pre-morning stillness. A middle-aged woman was behind the counter, flipping through a magazine. She looked up when I entered, her expression shifting from boredom to concern to alarm as she took in my appearance, gaunt, pale, wild-eyed, clutching a knife I'd forgotten I was still holding. "I need help," I managed to say, my voice hoarse from disuse. "My name is Lisa Miller. I was kidnapped 9 years ago." What followed is still a blur in my memory. The woman calling 911. Police arriving, their voices too loud, their movements too quick. Paramedics asking questions I couldn't process. Being wrapped in a blanket. The knife gently removed from my grip. The rising sun painting the sky pink and gold, the first sunrise I'd seen in 9 years. I remember insisting they take the papers I'd brought, trying to explain who Richard was, where he was, what he had done. I remembered the disbelief on their faces gradually giving way to horror as they realized who I was, the dead girl who wasn't dead after all. The hospital came next. Bright lights, beeping machines, doctors with gentle voices and pitying eyes. Tests that confirmed what 9 years of captivity had done to my body: malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, stress fractures never properly healed, respiratory issues from the mold, internal injuries from the assaults. A police officer stationed outside my door, not to keep me in but to keep threats out. I asked about Richard. Had they found him? Arrested him? They assured me they had, that he was in custody, that he would never hurt me again. I didn't believe them, not really. After spending so long in his power, the idea that he could simply be locked away seemed impossible. For weeks, I would wake screaming, convinced he was standing over my bed. Then came the day I'd both longed for and dreaded, the reunion with my family. The doctors had wanted to wait until I was stronger, but I couldn't bear another day of separation. I sat in my hospital room, wearing borrowed clothes, my hair freshly cut, my hands trembling in my lap. When the door opened and they walked in, my mother, my father, my brother Tommy, time seemed to fold in on itself. In my mind, they had remained exactly as they were the day I disappeared. The reality of their aged faces, the gray in my parents' hair, my brother now a grown man taller than our father, was a shock that left me speechless. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then my mother made a sound, half sob, half my name, and rushed forward. Her arms around me felt both familiar and strange. I had forgotten how to be hugged, how to receive physical affection that didn't bring pain. I stiffened, then slowly, awkwardly, returned the embrace. "My baby," she kept whispering. "My baby girl. You came back to us." The first weeks after my rescue were a surreal mixture of joy and trauma. Every experience was simultaneously new and overwhelming: sleeping in a real bed, eating regular meals, making simple decisions like what clothes to wear or what television show to watch. The doctors called it re-entry shock, a phenomenon common among hostages and prisoners of war. The world had changed dramatically during my absence. Cell phones were everywhere. Computers were smaller, faster. Something called social media had exploded. My family had moved to a new house. They couldn't bear to live in the old one after I disappeared. Tommy had graduated college. My parents had separated for a while after my disappearance, reuniting years later. And everyone knew who I was. My rescue had become national news. Basement girl found alive after 9 years screamed the headlines. Reporters camped outside the hospital, then outside my family's home. Everyone wanted an interview, wanted to hear the horrific details, wanted to package my suffering into a neat narrative of trauma and triumph. I refused them all. My story was mine alone, not entertainment, not inspiration, not a cautionary tale. The FBI agents and district attorneys got the facts they needed for prosecution, but even with them, I shared only what was necessary. Some experiences are too personal, too raw to be dissected by strangers. Richard's trial came 6 months after my escape. I testified behind a screen, unable to face him directly but determined that he would face justice. My voice shook as I detailed the years of captivity, the abuse, the psychological torture. The courtroom was silent except for my words and the occasional muffled sob from the gallery where my family sat. He was sentenced to life without parole. I felt nothing when the verdict was read, no closure, no relief, no vindication. Just emptiness. His imprisonment couldn't give me back the years he had taken. It couldn't erase the nightmares or heal the scars, visible and invisible. Justice, I was learning, is a poor substitute for never having been harmed in the first place. Recovery was not the linear journey I had expected. There were good days when I felt almost normal, when I could go to therapy and discuss my trauma with clinical detachment, when I could laugh with my family and imagine a future for myself. Then there were days when the sound of a door closing would send me into a panic attack, when I couldn't bear to be in a room with the lights off, when the mere thought of being touched made my skin crawl. 2 years after my rescue, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I wanted to go to college. Not to move on or get back to normal. Those phrases from well-meaning friends and family had always rung hollow to me. There was no going back to normal after what I had experienced. There was only going forward into whatever new normal I could create for myself. The community college was willing to work with me despite my lack of formal education. I took placement tests, worked with tutors, and gradually caught up on the learning I had missed. Sitting in classrooms was difficult at first, the noise, the people, the expectation to speak when called upon. But it gave me purpose, structure, a goal beyond simply surviving another day. I chose to study psychology, driven by a need to understand what had happened to me and to help others who had experienced trauma. In those textbooks about captivity, PTSD, and resilience, I found the language to describe my experiences, to contextualize them within a framework that made sense. It didn't heal me, but it helped me organize the chaos of my emotions into something I could examine and, slowly, begin to process. Dating proved more complicated. How do you explain to someone on a first date that you spent your teenage years in captivity? When do you tell them about the nightmares, the triggers, the days when being touched is unbearable? Most relationships ended before they really began, not because of rejection, but because of my own inability to bridge the gap between my experiences and theirs. Then I met Michael in my 3rd year of college, a quiet, patient man who worked in the campus library. He never pushed for details I wasn't ready to share. He never made me feel broken or damaged when I needed space. When I finally told him everything, he listened without interruption, without horror or pity in his eyes. "Thank you for trusting me with your story," was all he said when I finished. We've been together for 5 years now. Some nights I still wake up screaming. He has learned to talk me back to the present without touching me until I say it's okay. 12 years have passed since I walked out of that house into the night. I am 30-2 now, the same age my mother was when I was taken. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology and am halfway through a master's program in trauma counseling. I volunteer at a center for missing and exploited children, helping families navigate the nightmare I once lived in sometimes, in the best of cases, helping survivors like me find their way back to themselves. I still mark days on a calendar, not with desperate scratches on a wall, but with small achievements, moments when I reclaim another piece of myself. The first time I slept through the night without nightmares. The first time I gave a presentation in class without having a panic attack. The first time Michael touched me and I didn't flinch. People often ask if I've forgiven Richard. It's a question that reveals more about their discomfort with my story than any genuine concern for my healing. Forgiveness implies that the offense is in the past, that harm has ended. But I live with the consequences of his actions every day, in my health problems, my nightmares, my struggle to trust, my lost youth. Forgiveness is a luxury I cannot afford. What I have found instead is something more valuable, the absolute certainty that he no longer controls my life. He stole 9 years from me. I refuse to give him a single day more. I am Lisa Miller. I was missing, but now I am found. I was a victim, but now I am a survivor. My story didn't end in that basement. It began the moment I walked out.